Hey all, and welcome back to Fuzzy Dutchy Gaming and another build guide on the channel. Now this league, I've always wanted to make a champion melee character, making the most out of the Perseverance belt. Lightning Strike obviously seems the go-to, but I've played that skill to death. When I had a look on POB Ninja, because it's obviously fairly late in the league, most people have got like hundreds and hundreds of exalts pumped into champion Smite builds, so they play like Doriana's prototype with replica Dream Feathers and loads of ridiculous cluster jewels. But this can be really expensive and quite complex and would be really hard to make a build guide for the masses. So the idea was to make a build for well under 10x that performs well in most of the content in the game. And then later on, maybe next week, I'll bring a guide out for like the more expensive version, which would use Omniscience to pump out some proper DPS. So the character in total, I would say, cost me 6 to 7x to kit out, but I would say under 10x, you'll be comfortable just in case there's market spikes or changes in supply and demand. However, there's not really any item in this build that's not common, so the build should always be affordable. Now, the one thing that can jump in price when making a build that utilizes cluster jewels is a specific combo of notables on a cluster jewel. So there'll be a little section in the video later on which shows how to craft your own cluster jewels and hopefully make a nice profit along the way. My cat's decided to join in. So the idea of the build is for most content, I want the build to be super tanky and really safe. And actually in a lot of content, unless you're juicing up the altars, it's quite difficult to die unless you stack tons and tons of altar debuffs. And that's what I wanted to bring a guide out for players like me who are either old or mechanically not that great. I just want a build where you can make quite a few mistakes, learn mechanics if you need to, and you may take the odd death, but there's very little chance of you bricking an encounter in 6 portals. So the footage shown at the beginning was all done with a level 88 character. And as I said, it was for well under 10 exalts. The guide's going to talk through the gearing, why I use specific items. I'll also talk through options of how to get the gear cheaper or differently if, for example, things suddenly aren't available on the market. We'll then go into the skill gems as there's some important interactions that you need to know to make sure you're getting the most out of the build. Because if you don't follow certain things, you're going to be losing a ton of DPS. Survivability and clear speed. And then what we'll do is go through the skill tree and detail in POB and just talk about the defenses and the DPS a little bit more. I'm also going to quickly touch on how to use Smite because there's some interactions where you can get it to double hit, a bit like Lightning Strike. It's really simple though, but we'll cover that really quickly in the guide. I'll then cover how to level the build, and then finally there'll be a section, as I said, on how to craft your own clusters if the market dries up or the one you're looking for is really expensive. So before we get into the details, I just want to say that this isn't me saying this is the best skill for champion for this budget. I'm sure there's tons of builds that are equally as good or better than this for the money. But Smite is a fun skill to play. It's something I've wanted to do for a couple of leagues. And it's something that can definitely scale up. So this version, it maybe has 3 to 4 million DPS at best. But it's really tanky. But you can scale it up to 10, 15, 20 quite easily. With Omniscience, with keeping the tankiness in the build. And then the one good thing about this build is it doesn't use Mage Blood or Headhunter because the build is basically built around the Perseverance belt. So it's always going to stay relatively inexpensive. And I'm not going to chuck something in at the end and say, if you want to get more DPS, buy a Headhunter or buy a Mage Blood. So let's start with going through the gear I've got on the character. Now there'll be a POB in the description where the gear is slightly different because after I've crafted some of this gear, I realized I got a little bit lucky on some of the implicits and they can actually cost exalts worth of currency to roll. So there's ways around, but there's basically cheap ways around it. I essentially built the build more expensive than it needed to be, but I'll go through the items that differ from the POB, why they do and what you should look for. So let's jump into the gear. So the first thing we'll look at is the weapon, and we are using a Paradoxica for the fact that it deals double damage. The one I'm using was quite cheap. I think it was 40 to 50 chaos. Essentially, for a budget build, you want attacks, penetrate, elemental resistances, and critical strike chance and strength and intelligence. That's probably the best combo for cheap. The better one, but then they can be 5 or 6x, would be penetration mixed with attack speed and blood rage on kill. But they are much, much more expensive. So the build does lack a little bit in attack speed because the base is obviously 1.3. But the base crit chance on the weapon helps us make sure that we're hitting 100% crit chance. In terms of the shield, you can ignore the implicits. It's just the fact that the stats I want, this was the cheapest shield on the market. you basically want 30% chance to avoid elemental ailments and then 30% chance to suppress spell damage, or as high as you can get on both. Essentially, if you can get more, great. If you could get like 35 ailment avoidance, it can make some of the rest of the gear easy, but as a minimum, you really want 30 and 30. I paid less than an X for this shield. If you've got something where you can craft armor on, that will help, because the way the build works is it scales damage from armor and evasion. So as much as you can get that, the better. Doesn't matter what base, as long as it's got armor and evasion on it, or just evasion. Can't be a pure armor base, because you won't get spell suppression on it unless someone's recombinated it, and it's likely you won't get that item very cheap. For the helmet, this one differs from the POB because the implicit on it, which is mana reservation, is actually one of the rarest implicits. And when I went to recreate this helmet for a different character, I went through 3 exalts worth of implicits and didn't hit it. So what I would recommend for this is, instead of going for implicits, because implicits on helmet are actually quite bad, if you find a influence helmet that suits the build, then go for it. Other than that, I would get a helmet with grace reservation or wrath reservation. Then you don't need to worry about this 7% increased mana reservation efficiency. And then I've just rolled this with deafening essences of greed until I hit something that suited the build. So nothing amazing, but it does the job. For the 6 link, again, I spent too much money on this. I bought the base chest for about 100C, crafted elemental avoidance, and then crafted the implicits with Eldritch currency, and it cost about 1x in currency to get these implicits, but it could cost more. But actually, when I looked on the market, you can just buy these 6 linked with the implicits, with spell suppression and life, for between 1 to 2x. So that's what I recommend doing. If there are absolutely none on the market, then you might need to roll your own implicits, because they are really important. As I said, the build scales off of the belt, which we'll come on to in a minute. So the more armor and the more evasion we've got, obviously the tankier we are, but the more damage we do. But all you're looking for on this is spell suppression, life, and then something to craft ailment avoidance. For the amulet, this one can be fairly cheap. Essentially, you're just looking for life, crit multi, and any stats or resistances you might need to cap out the build, because it will vary depending what your other items are. And then you need to allocate sovereignty, which is 3 silver oils, because that gives us the last bit of mana reservation we need to run all the skills you can see in the bar up here. For rings, you're going to want to get minus mana cost on a ring. Essentially, other than that, bit of accuracy, resistances, life is really all you need. I would recommend trying to get 1 ring with a big chunk of intelligence on it, because that's probably going to be the issue on the build. If you're falling short of any stat, it's probably going to be intelligence. So I would look to maybe get an intelligence roll on one of the rings. I bought both these rings. They weren't particularly expensive. They were well less than 100C for both the rings combined. The gloves, I have upgraded them to +2, which are obviously like 7 or 8x, just because I'm planning to upgrade this build to an omniscience version. But strike, 1 target, and spell suppression is what you need, and they're about 60C, I think, from looking on trade. And then you just craft it yourself. I would recommend trying to buy one with spell suppression on it already made, because you're probably not going to spend much more than an X on the gloves. But what you're looking for is life and spell suppression and some resistances. That's really all you need. And then you need spell suppression and strike, 1 target as an implicit. Now, normally on builds that use plus strike, +2 makes a massive difference for clear. But because the way Smite works is it also does an AoE, striking just 1 extra target actually is fine for clear. 2 is better, but it's not actually that much worse with +1 additional target. If you've got a bit of money, obviously I'll recommend +2 because it is just comfier. For the boots, I haven't really rolled the implicits on these because they're not needed. You could roll implicits to get like action speed, maybe some more ailment avoidance, but it just adds cost to the build for little gain. You get like 5% attack speed, which is really minimal. Here, you're just looking for movement speed, life, and a big resistance, with then an open suffix to craft, avoid elemental ailments. Obviously, if you can fit something like spell suppression on it, go for it, because it might ease up requirements on other gear. All these things are obviously transferable. Like if you could get a massive spell suppression roll on your chest and shield, then you might not need them on gloves, or you might get a really small roll on gloves, small roll on boots. Like, as long as you're 100% capped with all your gear, that's all that really matters. Same with ailment avoidance. So if, for example, you find a pair of boots that's got an ailment avoidant implicit, which means you don't need the craft on your chest and craft, percentage life or something like that. But the idea of this build is tankiness first. So we want to be 100% spell suppression capped, and we want to be ailment immune. And then the last thing to come on to is the belt, which is perseverance. And this is kind of what brings the build together, because it gives 1% increased attack damage per 200 of your lowest armor or evasion. It also gives us onslaught while fortified, and because we're a champion, we're always fortified, which means you always have onslaught, which is really nice. So just to give an example of why this belt is so important on a champion, you have this node here, which gives us 30% increased effect of non-curse auras. And then we're also getting curse aura effect from our chest here, from sovereignty anointment, and then from this charisma wheel as well. So we end up getting not a huge amount, because you can go more. You can maybe split, like really go sparsely on your tree. You could go down here to get some effect, and probably get up here as well to get more. But I just found this was the most comfy way of doing it and getting a decent amount of life at the same time. So if we look at my stats with no flasks, it's just over 53k armor and just under 50k evasion. What you want this number to be as close together as possible, because it's the lowest number that gets the additional damage from the belt. So if you had 200k armor but you only had 10k evasion, you're getting a really small benefit from wearing perseverance. So if we just put our flasks on now, you can see I'm slightly over on armor, so it's 73k and 66k evasion. But that's balanced enough for me. I could go and fine tune it, but because I want to upgrade this build to omniscience version, then there's not really much point in doing that. So we'll now move on to the flasks, and these are really, really important, because as you can see from when we activate our flasks, a lot of our stats come from them. So you've got your usual instant recovery life flask. I would actually recommend the one that gives you 50% plus the rest over time, because of a mechanic we're going to come on to later that needs a half decent life flask. Quicksilver flask, granite, jade, and diamond. You'll need to check POB to see if you actually need a diamond flask, because we're going to be using Secrets of Suffering. I do. I only hit about 92% without the flask, so I've put that in. And you want your suffixes to be increased armor, increased attack speed, increased evasion, and increased crit strike chance. Doesn't matter which flask they go on, but you need all of these, especially the evasion and armor, because that makes a massive difference to the damage you can pump out when our flasks are active. And then the last thing to go through in terms of gear is the jewels on the tree. Now these I'm going to cover separately, so that'll be a different bookmark, because these are really important, because you need to make sure you get every one to be able to get all of your auras in. So this is just a corrupted blood. This socket is for a corrupted blood jewel for Cirrus. As you see, I've got quite a bad one, but I didn't want to buy one. This one was kicking around in my stash. That can be whatever you want it to be, that jewel socket. The rest of them we need. And none of these are expensive, and they're easy to roll if they do end up costing money. So the first one wants to be a 3 passive reservation of efficiency jewel with electric presence, which gives Wrath reduced reservation efficiency. These jewels are quite plentiful and they're quite cheap. With a 3 passive one, look for something else on it. So this one's got 5% chaos and 25% increased effect. So I get that from these 2 small nodes here. So I get 7% reservation efficiency instead of 6, and I get 6% chaos res instead of 5. Don't just buy bog standard jewels because you want to save 10 or 20 C. You can get decent stats on these jewels, and they are important. So the Watcher's Eye I've got is actually quite expensive. I think I paid 3 or 4x for it because it's got determination, gives armor on it. The stat you're actually really after is life gained while affected by vitality, because it adds a massive amount to our sustain. These are, I think, 1.5x with this stat on. You could probably spend 2.5 to get it with something else. I would say this jewel is optional, but it really, really does help. In the times where you might chunk your life, having life gain on hit with Smite really helps. Then moving to the bottom cluster, we've got Interrogation, because it's very, very difficult to get anywhere near crit chance on a budget. So now that it's mid-league, these are quite cheap. I think they're about 70C. Easily the best way to get your crit chance up to 100%. And then the other one, again, 3 passive mana reservation efficiency, but this time uncompromising, which is for determination. And again, this was a cheap jewel. It was 30 to 40 chaos, and it gives me cold res, all res, and life for each small passive. And that adds up. So all these passives together are a decent chunk of resistances and life. And then we'll come on to the large cluster jewels. Now, these can be expensive if you buy them because they're not on the market that often. So you either want sword and axes or increased attack damage. One jewel I would recommend getting the same as this one here. So feed the fury, fuel the fight, and martial prowess, because this takes care of all of our leech. So we have fuel the fight here for mana leech. We have feed the fury here for life leech. And then martial prowess is just a really good node. It's got damage, accuracy, and attack speed. It's just really, really good. Then in the second one, you can be a bit more liberal about what stats you get. You can get a much cheaper jewel. Really, you're just looking for something that gives you damage. So here I've got martial prowess, feed the fury, and calamitous. Now, I wouldn't necessarily have to path to this, but it was the best 2 points that I had at the time. You don't have to take this last 2 nodes here. As long as you've got all your mana and life leech covered in your first jewel, you could just path here and here and not these 2 and use it somewhere else in the tree. And so we're going to come on to how you craft these cluster jewels very quickly. That's it for the tree and the gems. There's not really much else to go through. There are loads of different ways to build this. If you want to change a tree in POB and it gives more damage, or there's certain items that you know work better, go for it. This is something, it's my first try at this kind of build. There was very little to go on POE Ninja, so I kind of had to put it together to the best of my knowledge. So before we move on and open up the POB, we'll look at all the gems in the gear. I recommend, if possible, you keep them in these particular setups, but you don't have to. Though. Other than the ones that are linked, you obviously need them to be in the same item. The rest are flexible because we don't have anything where we've got reservation for certain items or plus levels for certain items. They can go wherever you want. This is just the way I've put them. So in the sword, we've got mark on hit and assassin's mark, and then just an ancestral protector. In the helmet, I've put my auras. So I've got determination, wrath, grace, and then I've got a flame dash because leap slam is our main movement skill, but you still get those stupid grasping vines that leap slam can't get out of. So if you don't run flame dash, the only way to get out of those vines is to walk really slowly and probably die. In the shield is the leap slam and faster attack setup. And then there's a vitality as well. Going into the gloves, this is one mechanic I want to explain. So we use anger set up with divine blessing, and divine blessing essentially gives you like a temporary aura, but it disables all your other ones. But if you put it against your life, all your mana auras stay, you lose life, you get that extra aura. So it's a good way of getting an extra aura into the build. It's not the main reason we do it though. So you'll notice here I've got second wind, and I'll explain the setup in a moment. So we've got anger, divine blessing, life tap, and second wind. So if we have a look at our anger divine blessing, it costs 2,536 life. This needs to cost at least half of your life for the next interaction to work. So I've got 4,500 life, so it easily covers half of my life. The reason we're going to use it is for this ascendancy point here, first to strike, last to fall. So we gain adrenaline for 20 seconds when we reach low life, which now is under 50%. And adrenaline gives 100% increased damage, 25% increased attack and movement speed, and extra physical damage reduction. It's absolutely huge, and you want this up all the time. And having anger on a divine blessing allows us to do it really easy. So if we keep an eye on the auras up here, if I put my divine blessing on, then adrenaline procs and anger procs. Essentially, anger will last around 10 to 12 seconds. So every second proc of anger will hit adrenaline. So we'll hit anger again. You can use this as many times as you want, but obviously you've got to look out for your life. But essentially, just every 20 seconds, make sure you're definitely proccing it because you want to keep adrenaline up. Now, the other bonus with adrenaline is that it gives you 25% of life straight away. So if we look at my life bar, so I've got 4,400, so 25% is about 1,100. So we're going to drop down to around 2,000 health when we use our divine blessing, but instantly we're back up to 3,100, and then a life flask fixes the rest. And that's why I said maybe a 66% instant flask isn't the best because it's only 1,000 life. You probably want one with much higher recovery over time, but maybe reduced recovery time. And that, along with vitality, will get your life up much quicker than this piddly instant life flask. So that's the divine blessing setup, why it works. you realistically have to use it because it's so much extra damage. Not only do we get the anger aura, we get all the attack speed, we get the attack damage, we get defenses. It's a really, really important part of the build. And even though it is a bit fiddly, you really, really have to do it to make sure that you're making the most out of the build. Otherwise, DPS might feel a little bit bad. And then we'll just go over the boot. So here I've got just a Vile Molten Shell with increased duration. Again, if we pop Flasks and run our normal Molten Shell, it's 10k and it lasts 6 seconds. And then a Vile Molten Shell goes on for an absolute age, like nearly 20 seconds. And it's about 14 or 15k. So again, it's a really, really good defensive part of the build. And then the last thing we've got are, surprise, surprise, more auras. We've got 2020 Defiance Banner and then a Precision. So because of all of our reservations, so I've got it from the helmet, got it from the amulet, we've got it from the tree on all our small cluster jewels, we can fit in all of these auras and we've still got 107 mana left for stuff like, you know, the mark on hit and our skills and stuff like that. And I've got 1 minus mana cost crafted because that brings it down to 18, which is reasonable considering we're using multi-strike. And then I'll just go and talk through the gems I've got in the 6 link. These might not be optimal in terms of damage. I think you could certainly use Close Combat would be a really good gem. But because we need to use Brittle to get our crit, and Brittle comes from cold damage, I have to run added cold because if I don't, I've got very little cold damage in the build. So the gems are, we have our Smite, which I've got at 2023. It was like next to nothing. I think it was like 10 cows or something. It was dirt cheap. Ellie damage with attacks. Multi-strike, which I don't normally like multi-strike. I find it really clunky, but we have such low base attack speed on our Paradoxica that we have to run multi-strike for it not to feel really bad. So if we take multi-strike out, you can see the speed of the attack is just way too slow. Even if we proc Adrenaline, it's still not particularly quick. Whereas if we stick multi-strike in, it's just so much quicker to attack. So we've got added cold. As said, this could be awakened added cold because they're dirt cheap. Because we need that cold damage for Brittle. Then we have increased crit damage and Trinity. So Trinity is just, should instantly proc anyway. We use Wrath, we use Anger, we've got cold damage. There's no way in the world that Trinity won't proc. If your Trinity isn't procking, I would say you're probably doing something wrong. And then that covers off all the gems. So the last thing to talk about before we move on to POB is the interaction with Smite in terms of double hitting. So if we look at the gem itself, it says it performs a melee attack and causes lightning to strike a targeted location or nearby enemy, dealing damage in an area. It says if the melee strike hits a target, that enemy can't be hit by the area damage. But if the skill hits another enemy, then it can be affected by the area damage. So the way this works, because we've got additional strike, is you want to be standing a little distance away from the enemy. So say where Nico is there. When you hit, you'll miss with your melee. The area damage will hit, and then you'll see your clone from your plus strike appear and hit Nico. So the clone will hit and the area damage will hit. So that will give you 2 lots of damage. If you get really close, that's not going to happen because you're hitting Nico with your sword and you're not going to get that area damage. So what I will do, I'll actually go into a map and try and get a map with loads of extra boss life. And I need a boss that isn't going to move so I can actually do this properly. Beach is a little bit annoying. Let's have a look. Okay, so we'll do Bone Crypt, and I'm going to try and roll it to get lots of monster life on the map. Okay, so this one will do. So this has got 47% increased monster life, so hopefully it doesn't insta-die. And we can go and have a play around with this interaction. So I'm not going to put any of this stuff on it because I just want to get to the boss. So I'm at the boss, so I'm just going to clear out these enemies, and I'm going to go right up to the boss. And you can see the damage is quite slow. If we then go back out and hit, you can see the 2 lots hitting and how much quicker the damage goes. As you get closer, it gets a bit worse. Don't worry about that damage. I didn't have any of my blessings activated or anything. That's just an example to show don't go right on top of the boss because you're going to really gimp your damage. It's similar to Lightning Strike. You just want to be that sort of little distance away so that you're hitting with your Ancestral Call rather than your main attack, and then you'll hit with your strike and your AoE. So with that very quick demonstration out the way, that's kind of gone through the gear and the jewels. So what I'll do now is just jump into POB, talk through the tree a little bit, and look at the gear on the POB because it's slightly different to the one that I'm wearing at the moment. I'll also, while I'm in there, talk about how to level the build, and then we'll just finish off with showing how to craft the cluster jewels if you wanted to do it on your own. So what we'll do, we'll just quickly look through POB. Now there's a couple of options that I didn't mention in the video, which I'll mention now. Firstly, I'd recommend using a lethal pride jewel in this jewel slot. It helps with strength requirements, which can be a bit of a problem on this side of the tree. It also helps because there's lots of melee crit chance, melee multipliers, extra strength, extra life, loads of different things here. Two things you don't want on this jewel are fizz taken as fire, because our fizz mitigation is easily the best part of our defense. We have 90% fizz mitigation most of the time, but we only have 75% elemental resistances, so you don't want to be transferring physical damage over to elemental damage. It's the same for all your gear as well. You don't want any fizz taken as elemental because you'll actually end up taking more damage. And then the other thing is double damage normally is what you look for on a lethal pride, but because we're using Paradoxica and we have a 100% chance to deal double damage, it won't do anything on this build. So what you want to look for are things like strength, melee crit chance, melee multiplier. Intimidate on hit is useful, but we intimidate when enemies are on full life anyway. So really what you'd be using this for is life, crit chance, and crit multiplier. The jewel I've got, ignore the one in the POB because this is really looking towards the omniscience version. So I've got lots of increased strength and percent strength to help add up to the omniscience value. But I would recommend using this jewel purely just for the strength requirements and eking out some extra melee crit multiplier. If you haven't used these jewels before, they're essentially just a random jewel. Buy any jewel from trade that isn't corrupted. You then use a divine orb on it, and it just randomly allocates stats to all the major nodes that you have allocated on the tree. So you just keep using divine orbs until you find one that you like. If you've already got your strength requirement sorted, you could definitely put another jewel in here. It's not necessarily something you have to run. I just think it really helps ease the requirements. And then here where I have my corrupted blood jewel, if you really want to get a big damage boost, I'd recommend Mantra of Flames. This gives you a fire attack damage per buff on you, and we run loads of auras. So as you can see, if we drop this jewel, we lose 360k DPS, which is almost 9% damage. So this is another option. They're really, really cheap. You might even be able to get a corrupted blood one, but I don't know how much they would cost. I would think that'd at least be a few X. But these jewels are dirt cheap. Just get one with a high attack roll, and it's going to give you a really big boost to your DPS. So this tree here is the same as I was running in the build. I've actually amended the Watcher's Eye because I had quite an expensive Watcher's Eye in the demonstration. It didn't actually make a difference because the Watcher's Eye we had armor on it, but we were over our evasion on armor anyway. Even removing that stat from the Watcher's Eye was still over on armor, so it hasn't actually made the slightest bit of difference to the build. So there'd be no reason to go that expensive. Just life gained on hit by vitality is what I would look for. It rolls up to 30, just get the highest roll that you can. As I said, on trade, they're about 1.5x. So the only item I've changed is I've removed the aura mana reservation implicit from the helmet, and I've added Wrath has 30% increased mana reservation efficiency. This could be Wrath, Determination, or it can be Grace. It can be either of them. They're all dirt cheap. You just need an armor and evasion base with that enchant on it. And then, as I said, you're going to roll it with Essences of Greed anyway. And then all that stuff combined leaves you in a healthy spot in terms of your mana. So the tree I've put on here is for level 91 because I haven't finished leveling this character yet, so I'm only 88. The additional nodes I've gone are these ones here because they are quite a lot of damage. So you're going to see extra damage compared to what I had in the video because I wasn't running Mantra of Flames and I wasn't running these nodes here. And this again is 10% DPS increase just for these three nodes. So when all our buffs and stuff are up, the melee hit is over 4 mil and the area hit's going to be 3.5. And as I say, you can get things to double hit. This is kind of in a best case scenario with all your flasks and your totem and stuff. So it's obviously going to be a bit less than that in the long run, but overall that's the kind of burst DPS that you can get. So we'll go into the config just to show how to configure this. So with the jewel here, I've actually gone for a cheaper jewel here because the one that I had in the video was sort of 1.5x. These are about 80. So Smite the Weak replaces Martial Prowess, or I can't remember what it's called, Martial something or other. This replaces it because it's a cheaper combo, and it's actually really decent for DPS because it gives us 40% damage against maimed enemies and 10% chance to maim. So on bosses, you're definitely going to maim. And that's why I've got maimed ticked in the box here. These Brittle, Scorch, and Sap I've just taken from the Cirrus fight. They're obviously going to vary. So Brittle is the one that you really want to make sure you're getting close to 10. It doesn't have to be 10. With Flasks up, as you can see, if we've got our Flasks up, it can drop down to sort of 5. And you're still fine. You're at 95%. If we drop the Diamond Flask, as you can see, then it starts to get a little bit more important that you get your Brittle up to 10. But on bosses, as I say, on Cirrus I was hitting 10. On Conquerors and stuff I was hitting 10. Don't try and take this build into Simulacrum, because as soon as you get something where it's reduced ailment effect, or they've got loads of cold resistance, you're not going to get any Brittle and you're not going to get any crit chance. So this version of the build, the kind of budget one, I would not take into Simulacrums. Set our resonant count to 50. Not really done much else. We've done frenzy charges because we generate frenzy charges on bosses. Adrenaline, as I said, look at the difference. You always want to be using adrenaline, and then we'll always be leeching because we're using mana constantly. And that's it. There's no like shenanigans going on. There's nothing particularly complex with the way it's configured. I've left some really brief notes in the POB, which is just me kind of tracking how the build was going. So it's got a few rough costs for the items and the jewels, interrogation, and then just some general notes that I made when I was playing the build. They're kind of nonsense, so you don't have to read them. They're just there just to show my kind of train of thought as I was making the build. And then before we move away from the POB, I'll just quickly show you the omniscience version that I've got planned. I've already got all the gear for it. So I'll be transitioning to it as soon as I can. So I think it's called Rubbish Smite. So obviously this is a level 100 tree, so that's probably not going to happen. So we'll go down to level 94. So yeah, this is kind of a very rough omniscience version that I've got the gear for. It can be optimized loads, like I've got 100, 110x I can spend on the build, and I plan to push it really, really far. So yeah, melee hits 9, area hits 7, so you're looking at kind of 16 mil combined DPS, and it can still definitely be optimized, and we could push some more levels out of it. But that's what I'm going to work on next, and that's what the next build guide is going to be. So all I'll do now to close off the video is I'll mention Pantheons very quickly. So I'll just really quickly mention Pantheons because I haven't put them in here. I'll run Arakali just because I want the extra chaos resistance against dots, because I'm not anywhere near chaos resistance cap. You get extra recovery if you've stopped taking damage over time, and lots of things around damage over time, which is what really is killing everyone this league. Then your second Pantheon is really going to be down to what content you're doing. I'm lazy, so I leave it on Abarath all the time because I farm Exile maps and there's burning ground all over the place. So it gives you a bit of movement speed when you're on it and you're unaffected by it. But feel free to kind of play around and pick whatever Pantheons you want. If you're leveling it from scratch, bandits, we're killing it all. So before we move on to the cluster jewel crafting, I just really want to quickly touch on leveling the build. Essentially, you're going to level with Hollow Palm. It's so easy. There'll be a link to a video that Firegrass did where he's got this Bible basically of leveling any class with Hollow Palm. It's amazing. It's really, really detailed. It's what I followed, and it was a cinch leveling. I didn't even try and level quick, and I was through the campaign well under 4 hours with all my labs and my skill points. So the last thing to look at is cluster jewels. So just thought I'd show an example of what I did in regard to cluster jewels. Because I looked on the market, and for this specific one, which is Feed the Fury, Fuel the Fight, and Martial Prowess, it was looking up to nearly 2x for a sword and attack one or an attack damage one. But there are a few different combinations you can use. So you basically need Fuel the Fight and Feed the Fury on our cluster jewel. You could have one on here and one on here, and that's all you really need for your leech. And then the rest of the cluster notables, you just want to have 3 notables because it makes the travel distance shorter, and anything that gives damage is good. So the only thing to note is I think Fuel the Fight only appears at the end of the cluster jewel, so you have to take at least the back end of one of the cluster jewels. But as I said, you don't have to take the back end of the second one. So what I thought I'd do, because even just bog standard cluster jewels with any 3 notables are sort of 80 to 90 chaos. And then I bought an Exalt's worth of the serrated fossil. So I've got the footage just shown in the corner now of the process of doing it, but you literally just do the single resonators and then you put them on to cluster jewels. So what I will say is, from going through, it's much harder to roll the axe and sword ones because there's a lot more notables that can roll. So these I definitely would not recommend if you're crafting. I would always go attack damage. So the shield ones are also fairly easy to roll, but you might end up with nodes that you don't really want, like block or counter attack or stuff like that. But I managed to craft this one, which is Martial Prowess, Drive the Destruction, and Feed the Fury. Crafted this one, which this one's not that great. Fuel the Fight, Martial Prowess, and Devastator, which is enemies explode, but it's only for 1/10 of their health with a 15% chance, so they're pretty bad. Then obviously I crafted this one, which is the one you would be looking for, which is Martial Prowess, Fuel the Fight, and Feed the Fury. And I also crafted this one, which is pretty decent, which is Smite the Weak, Feed the Fury, and Calamitous. So if cluster jewels are too expensive, I wouldn't worry too much about spending currency on resonators and fossils. You're very likely to end up with 2 or 3 cluster jewels that are usable, and then you might even end up with more. So I could sell a lot of these cluster jewels, easily make my money back, and then I could still be left over with this cluster jewel, which is the one that I was looking for. So that's all I wanted to include in the video, because I know sometimes when videos come out and I've got specific cluster jewels in, people are, oh, it's 5x because the whole market's been bought out. Doesn't mean that jewel is worth 5x, especially ones like these. They're fairly easy to roll. So that's it for this video. I think I've covered everything I need. If I haven't, I will appear in a minute saying what I've missed out. So what I'm going to do now is spend maybe a few days leveling up the character a bit more, getting to 92, 93. And then, in all honesty, I plan on spending most of my currency on this character just to see where I could get them. So I have 81 Exalts. I've already got a ton of good Omni gear, jewels, got Omniscient, stuff like that. So the plan is to, if I can, because I might not be able to spend all this currency on this build, try and get up to sort of 20, 30 million DPS, super tanky, like easily clearing wave 30 simulacrum, stuff like that. And then just see where we get. Once I have spent all the currency and made the build, I will bring a guide out for it, even though it's obviously not going to be suitable for that many people if it's like 200x budget. But I just wanted to show a process where you can gear a build for less than 10 Exalts, and this build would then be able to farm you basically as much currency as you want, because it can do really anything in the game other than sort of maybe uber bossing and wave 30 simulacrums. You can just pick the content that you want to run, you can run it fairly quickly and efficiently and start making some currency. So that's it for this guide. Thank you very much for watching. Take care and see you in the next one.